Chapter 13 of Pioneers of the Old South by Mary Johnston. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Rebellion and Change. Bacon, with an increased army, now rode out once more against the Indians. He made a rendezvous on the upper York, the old Pamunkey, and to this center he gathered horsemen until there may have been with him not far from 1,000 mounted men. From here he sent detachments against the red men's villages in all the upper troubled country and afar into the Sunset Woods, where the pioneers' cabin had not yet been builded. He acted with vigor. The Indians could not stand against his horsemen and concerted measures, and back they fell before the white men, westward again. Or if they stayed in the ever-dwindling villages, they gave hostages and oaths of peace. Quiet seemed to descend once more upon the border. But if the frontier seemed peaceful, Virginia behind the border was a bubbling cauldron. Bacon had now become a hero of the people, a Siegfried capable of slaying the dragon. Nor were Lawrence and Drummond idle, nor others of their way of thinking. The Indian troubles might soon be settled, but why not go further, marching against other troubles, more subtle and long continuing, and threatening all the future? In the midst of this speculation and promise of change, the governor, feeling the storm, dissolved the Assembly, proclaimed Bacon and his adherents rebels and traitors, and made a desperate attempt to raise an army for use against the new-fangledness of the time. This last he could not do. Private interest led many planters to side with him, and there was a fair amount of passionate conviction matching his own, that His Majesty the King and the forces of law and order were being withstood, and without just cause. But the mass of the people cried out to his speeches, "Bacon! Bacon!" As the popular leader had been warned from Jamestown by news of personal danger, so in his turn Berkeley seems to have believed that his own liberty was threatened. With suddenness he departed the place, boarded a sloop, and was wafted over Chesapeake Bay 30 miles to Accomac. The news of the governor's flight, producing both alarm in one party and enthusiasm in the other, tended to precipitate the crisis. Though the Indian trouble might by now be called adjusted, Bacon, far up the York, did not disband his men. He turned and with them marched down country, not to Jamestown, but to a hamlet called Middle Plantation, where later was to grow the town of Williamsburg. Here he camped, and here took counsel with Lawrence and Drummond and others, and here addressed, with a curious lofty eloquence, the throng that began to gather. Hence, too, he issued a declaration recounting the misdeeds of those lately in power, protesting against the terms rebel and traitor as applied to himself and his followers, who are only in arms to protect His Majesty's demesne and subjects, and calling on those who are well disposed to reform to join him at Middle Plantation, there to consider the state of the country, which had been brought into a bad way by Sir William's doting and irregular actings. Upon his proclamation many did come to Middle Plantation, great planters and small, men just freed from indentured service, holders of no land and little land and much land, men of all grades of weight and consideration, and all degrees of revolutionary will, from Drummond, with a reported speech, "I am in overshoes, I will be in overboots," and a wife, Sarah, who snapped a stick in two with the cry, "I care no more for the power of England than for this broken straw," to those who would be revolutionary as long as, and only when, it seemed safe to be so. How much of revolution, despite that speech about His Majesty's demesne and subjects, was in Bacon's mind, or in Richard Lawrence's mind, and William Drummond's mind, or in the mind of their staunchest supporters, may hardly now be resolved, perhaps, as much as was in the mind of Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Mason a century later. The Governor was in Accomac, breathing fire and slaughter, though as yet without brand or sword with which to put his ardent desires into execution. But he and the constituted order were not without friends and supporters. He had, as his opponents saw, a number of wicked and pernicious counselors, aids and assistants against the commonalty in these our cruel commotions. Moreover, and a great moreover, is that it was everywhere bruited that he had sent to England, to the King, for 2,000 redcoats. Perhaps the King, perhaps England, will take his view, and not consulting the good of Virginia, send the redcoats. What then? Bacon, as a measure of opposition, proposed a test or recognition to be signed by those here at Middle Plantation who earnestly do wish the good of Virginia. It was a bold test. Not only should they covenant to give no aid to the whilome governor against this new general and army, but if ships should bring the redcoats, they were to withstand them. There is little wonder that this bugbear did marvelously startle that body of Virginia horsemen, those progressive gentlemen planters, and others. Yet in the end, after violent contentions, the Assembly at Middle Plantation drew up and signed a remarkable paper, the Oath at Middle Plantation. Historically, it is linked, on the one hand, with that thrusting out of his government of Sir John Harvey in Charles the First's time, and on the other with Virginian proceedings 100 years later under the third George. If His Majesty had been, as it was rumored, wrongly informed that Virginia was in rebellion, if acting upon that misinformation he sent troops against his loyal Virginians, who were armed only against an evil governor and intolerable woes, then these same good loyalists would oppose and suppress all forces whatsoever of that nature, until such time as the King be fully informed of the state of the case. What was to happen if the King, being informed, still supported Berkeley and sent other redcoats, was not taken into consideration. This paper, being drawn, was the more quickly signed because there arrived, in the midst of the debate, a fresh Indian alarm. Attack threatened a fort upon the York, whence the Governor had seen fit to remove arms and ammunition. The news came most opportunely for Bacon. There were no more discourses. The major portion of the large assemblage signed. The old government in Virginia was thus denied, but it was held that government there must be, and that the people of Virginia, through representatives, must arrange for it. Writs of election, made as usual in the King's name, and signed by Bacon and by those members of the Council who were of the revolt, went forth to all counties. The Assembly thus provided was to meet at Jamestown in September. So much business done, off rode Bacon and his men to put down this latest rising of the Indians. Not only these, but red men in a new quarter, tribes south of the James, kept them employed for weeks to come. Nor were they unmindful of that proud old man, Sir William Berkeley, over on the eastern shore, a well-peopled region where traveling by boat and by sandy road was sufficiently easy. Bacon, Lawrence, and Drummond finally decided to take Sir William captive and to bring him back to Jamestown. For this purpose they dispatched a ship across the bay with 250 men under the command of Giles Bland, a man of courage and haughty bearing and no great admirer of Sir William's goodness. The ship proceeded to the Accomac shore, anchored in some bight, and sent ashore men to treat with the Governor. But the Governor turned the tables on them. He made himself captor instead of being made captive. Bland and his lieutenants were taken, whereupon their following surrendered into Berkeley's hands. Bland's second in command was hanged. Bland himself was held in irons. Now Berkeley's star was climbing. In Accomac he gathered so many that with those who had fled with him and later recruits who crossed the bay, he had perhaps 1,000 men. He stowed these upon the ship of the ill-fated Bland and upon a number of sloops. With 17 sail in all, the old governor set his face west and south towards the mouth of the James. In that river, on the 7th of September, 1676, there appeared this fleet of the King's Governor, set on retaking Virginia. Jamestown had notice. The Bacon faction held the place with perhaps 800 men, Colonel Hansford at their head. Summoned by Berkeley to surrender, Hansford refused, but that same night, by advice of Lawrence and Drummond, evacuated the place, drawing his force off toward the York. The next day, emptied of all but a few citizens, Jamestown received the old governor and his army. The tidings found Bacon on the upper York. Acting with his accustomed energy, he sent out far and wide ringing appeals to the country to rouse itself, for men to join him and march to the defeat of the old tyrant. Numbers did come in. He moved with marvelous celerity. When he had for the time and place a large force of rebels, he marched by stream and plantation, tobacco field and forest, forge and mill, through the early autumn country to Jamestown. Civil war was on. Across the narrow neck of the Jamestown peninsula had been thrown a sort of fortification with ditch, earthwork, and palisade. Before this Bacon now sounded trumpets. No answer coming, but the mouths of cannon appearing at intervals above the breastwork, the rebel general halted, encamped his men, and proceeded to construct siege lines of his own. The work must be done exposed to Sir William's iron shot. Now comes a strange and discreditable incident. Patriots, revolutionists, who on the whole would serve human progress, have yet, as have we all, dark spots and seamy sides. Bacon's parties of workmen were threatened, hindered, driven from their task by Berkeley's guns. Bacon had a curious, unadmirable idea. He sent horsemen to neighboring loyalist plantations to gather up and bring to camp, not the planters, for they are with Berkeley in Jamestown, but the planters' wives. Here are Mistress Bacon, wife of the elder Nathaniel Bacon, Mistress Bray, Mistress Ballard, Mistress Page, and others. Protesting, these ladies enter Bacon's camp, who sends one as envoy into the town with the message that if Berkeley attacks, the whole number of women shall be placed as shield to Bacon's men who build earthworks. He was as good or as bad as his word. At the first show of action against his workmen, these royalist women were placed in the front and were kept there until Bacon had made his counter line of defense. Sir William Berkeley had great faults, but at times, not always, he displayed chivalry. For that day the ladies' white aprons guarded General Bacon and all his works. The next day, the defense is completed, this white guard was withdrawn. Berkeley waited no longer, but though now at a disadvantage, opened fire and charged with his men through gate and over earthworks. The battle that followed was short and decisive. Berkeley's chance-gathered army was no match for Bacon's seasoned Indian fighters and for desperate men who knew that they must win or be hanged for traitors. The governor's force wavered and, unable to stand its ground, turned and fled, leaving behind some dead and wounded. Then Bacon, who also had cannon, opened upon the town and the ships that rode before it. In the night the King's Governor embarked for the second time, and with him in that armada from the eastern shore the greater part of the force he had gathered. When dawn came, Bacon saw that the ships, large and small, were gone, sailing back to Accomac. Bacon and his following thus came peaceably into Jamestown, but with the somewhat fell determination to burn the place. It should harbor no more rogues. What Bacon, Lawrence, Drummond, Hansford, and others really hoped, whether they forecasted a republican Virginia, finally at peace and prosperous, whether they saw in a vision a new capital, perhaps at Middle Plantation, perhaps at the Falls of the Far West, a capital that should be without old tyrannic memories, cannot now be said. However it all may be, they put torch to the old capital town and soon saw it consumed, for it was no great place and not hard to burn. Jamestown had hardly ceased to smoke when news came that loyalists under Colonel Brent were gathering in northern counties. Bacon, now ill but energetic to the end, turned with promptness to meet this new alarm. He crossed the York and marched northward through Gloucester County. But the rival forces did not come to a fight. Brent's men deserted by the double handful. They came into Bacon's ranks, resolving with the Persians to go and worship the rising sun. Or, hanging fire, reluctant to commit themselves either way, they melted from Brent, running homeward by every road. Bacon, with an enlarged, not lessened army, drew back into Gloucester. Revolutionary fortunes shone fair in prospect, yet it was but the moment of brief deceptive bloom before decay and fall. At this critical moment Bacon fell sick and died. Some said that he was poisoned, but that has never been proved. The illness that had attacked him during his siege of Jamestown and that held on after his victory seems to have sufficed for his taking off. In Gloucester County he surrendered up that fort he was no longer able to keep into the hands of that grim and all-conquering Captain Death. His body was buried, says the old account, but where deposited till the general day not known, only to those who are resolutely silent in that particular. With Bacon's death there fell to pieces all this hopeful or unhopeful movement. Lawrence might have a subtle head and Drummond the courage to persevere. Hansford, Cheeseman, Bland, and others might have varied abilities, but the passionate and determined Bacon had been the organ of action. Bacon's the eloquence that could bring to the cause men with property to give as well as men with life to lose. It is a question how soon, had Bacon not died, must have failed his attempt at revolution, desperate because so premature. Back came Berkeley from Accomac, his turbulent enemy thus removed. All who from the first had held with the King's Governor now rode emboldened. Many who had shouted more or less loudly for the rising star, now that it was so untimely set, made easy obeisance to the old sun. A great number who had wavered in the wind now declared that they had done no such thing, but had always stood steadfast for the ancient powers. The old governor, who might once have been magnanimous, was changed for the worse. He had been withstood, he would punish. He now gave full rein to his passionate temper, his bigotry for the throne, and his feeling of personal wrong. He began in Virginia to outlaw and arrest rebels and to doom them to hasty trials and executions. There was no longer a united army to meet, but only groups and individuals striving for safety in flight or hiding. Hansford was early taken and hanged, with two lieutenants of Bacon, Wilford and Farlow. Cheeseman died in prison. Drummond was taken in the swamps of the Chickahominy and carried before the governor. Berkeley brought his hands together. "Mr. Drummond, you are very welcome. I am more glad to see you than any man in Virginia. Mr. Drummond, you shall be hanged in half an hour." Not in half an hour, but on the same day he was hanged, imperturbable Scot to the last. Lawrence, held by many to have been more than Bacon the true author of the attempt, either put an end to himself or escaped northward, for he disappears from history. The last account of Mr. Lawrence was from an uppermost plantation, whence he and four other desperadoes, with horses, pistols, etc., marched away in a snow ankle deep. They were thought to have cast themselves into a branch of some river, rather than to be treated like Drummond. Thus came to early and untimely end the ringleaders of Bacon's rebellion. In all, by the governor's command, 37 men suffered death by hanging. There comes to us down the centuries the comment of that king for whom Berkeley was so zealous, a man who fell behind his colonial governor in singleness of interest, but excelled him in good nature. "That old fool," said the second Charles, "has hanged more men in that naked country than I have done for the murder of my father." That letter which Berkeley had written some months before to his sovereign about the waters of rebellion was now seen to have borne fruit. In January, while the governor was yet running down fugitives, confiscating lands and hanging traitors, a small fleet from England sailed in, bringing a regiment of red coats, and with them 3 commissioners charged with the duty of bringing order out of confusion. These commissioners, bearing the King's proclamation of pardon to all upon submission, were kinder than the irascible and vindictive Governor of Virginia, and they succeeded at last in restraining his fury. They made their report to England, and after some months obtained a second royal proclamation censuring Berkeley's vengeful course, so derogatory to our princely clemency, abrogating the Assembly's more violent acts, and extending full pardon to all concerned in the late rebellion, saving only the arch rebel Bacon, to whom perhaps it now made little difference if they pardoned him or not. But with this piece of good nature, so characteristic of the second Charles, there came neither to the King in person nor to England as a whole any appreciation of the true ills behind the Virginian revolt, nor any attempt to relieve them. Along with the King's first proclamation came instructions for the Governor: "You shall be no more obliged to call an Assembly once every year, but only once in 2 years. Also, whensoever the Assembly is called, 14 days shall be the time prefixed for their sitting, and no longer." And the narrowed franchise that Bacon's Assembly had widened is narrowed again: "You shall take care that the members of the Assembly be elected only by freeholders, as being more agreeable to the custom of England." Nor is the grant to Culpeper and Arlington revoked, nor wider and deeper are the navigation laws in any wise bettered. No more than before, no more indeed than a century later, is there any conception that the child exists no more for the parent than the parent for the child. Sir William Berkeley's loyalty had in the end overshot itself. His zeal fatigued the King, and in 1677 he was recalled to England. As Governor of Virginia he had been long popular at first, but in his old age detested. He had great personal courage, fidelity, and generosity for those things that ran with the current of a deep and narrow soul. He passes from the New World stage a marked and tragic figure. Behind him is vengeances displeased even loyalist Virginia, willing on the whole to let bygones be bygones among neighbors and kindred. It is said that when his ship went down the river, bonfires were lighted and cannon and muskets fired for joy. And so beyond the eastward horizon fades the old reactionary. Herbert Jeffreys and then Sir Henry Chicheley followed Berkeley as governors of Virginia. They are succeeded by Lord Culpeper, and he by Lord Howard of Effingham. King Charles dies and James II rules in England. Culpeper and Effingham play the governor merely for what they can get for themselves out of Virginia. The price of tobacco goes down, down. The crops are too large. The old poor remedies of letting much acreage go unplanted, or destroying and burning where the measure of production is exceeded, and of petitions to the King are all resorted to, but they procure little relief. Virginia cannot be called prosperous. England hears that the people are still disaffected and unquiet, and England stolidly wonders why. During the reign of the second Charles, Maryland had suffered from political unrest somewhat less than Virginia. The autocracy of Maryland was more benevolent and more temperate than that of her southern neighbor. The name of Calvert is a better symbol of wisdom than the name of Berkeley. Cecil Calvert, second Lord Baltimore, dying in 1675, has a fair niche in the temple of human enlightenment. His son Charles succeeded, third Lord Baltimore and Lord Proprietary of Maryland. Well intentioned, this Calvert lacked something of the ability of either his father or his grandfather. Though he lived in Maryland while his father had lived in England, his government was not as wise as his father's had been. But in Maryland, even before the death of Cecil Calvert, inherent evils were beginning to form of themselves a visible body. In Maryland, as in Virginia, there set in after the Restoration a period of reaction, of callous rule in the interests of an oligarchy. In 1669 a packed council and an aristocratic assembly procured a restriction of the franchise similar to that introduced into Virginia. As in Virginia, an assembly deemed of the right political hue was kept in being by the device of adjournment from year to year. In Maryland, as in Virginia, public officials were guilty of corruption and graft. In 1676 there seems to have lacked for revolt in Maryland only the immediate provocative of acute Indian troubles in such leaders as Bacon, Lawrence, and Drummond. The new Lord Baltimore being for the time in England, his deputy writes him, that never were any more replete with malignancy and frenzy than our people were about August last, and they wanted but a monstrous head to their monstrous body. Two leaders indeed appeared, Davis and Pate by name, but having neither the standing nor the strength of the Virginia rebels, they were finally taken and hanged. What supporters they had dispersed, and the specter of armed insurrection passed away. The third Lord Baltimore, like his father, found difficulty in preserving the integrity of his domain. His father had been involved in a long wrangle over the alleged invasion of Maryland by the Dutch. Since then New Netherland had passed into English hands. Now there occurred another encroachment on the territory of Maryland. This time the invader was an Englishman named William Penn. Just as the idea of a New World freedom for Catholics had appealed to the first Lord Baltimore, so now to William Penn, the Quaker, came the thought of freedom there for the Society of Friends. The second Charles owed an old debt to Penn's father. He paid it in 1681 by giving to the son whom he liked a province in America. Little by little, in order to gain for Penn access to the sea, the terms of his grant were widened until it included, beside the huge Pennsylvanian region, the tract that is now Delaware, which was then claimed by Baltimore. Maryland protested against the grant to Penn, as Virginia had protested against the grant to Baltimore, and equally in vain. England was early set upon the road to many colonies in America, destined later to become many states. One by one they were carved out of the first great unity. In 1685 the tolerant Charles II died. James II, a Catholic, ruled England for about 3 years and then fled before the Revolution of 1688. William and Mary, sovereigns of a Protestant England, came to the throne. We have seen that the Proprietary of Maryland and his numerous kinsmen and personal adherents were Catholics. Approximately 1 in 8 of other Marylanders were fellows in that faith. Another eighth of the people held with the Church of England. The rest, the mass of the folk, were dissenters from that church. And now all the Protestant elements together, the Quakers excepted, solidified into political and religious opposition to the Proprietary's rule. Upon the accession of William and Mary, dispatched orders to the Maryland Council to proclaim them king and queen. But his messenger died at sea, and there was delay in sending another. In Maryland the council would not proclaim the new sovereigns without instructions, and it was even rumored that Catholic Maryland meant to withstand the new order. In effect, the old days were over. The Protestants, churchmen, and dissenters alike proceeded to organize under a new leader, one John Coode. They formed an association in arms for the defense of the Protestant religion and for asserting the right of King William and Queen Mary to the province of Maryland and all the English dominions. Now followed a confused time of accusations and counter-accusations, with assertions that Maryland Catholics were conspiring with the Indians to perpetrate a new St. Bartholomew massacre of Protestants, and hot counter-assertions that this is a sleeveless fear and imagination fomented by the artifice of some ill-minded persons. In the end, Coode assembled a force of something less than 1,000 men and marched against St. Mary's. The council which had gathered there surrendered, and the Association for the Defense found itself in power. It proceeded to call a convention and to memorialize the king and queen, who in the end approved its course. Maryland passed under the immediate government of the Crown. Lord Baltimore might still receive quit rents and customs, but his governmental rights were absorbed into the monarchy. Sir Lionel Copley came out as royal governor, and a new order began in Maryland. The heyday of Catholic freedom was past. England would have a Protestant America. Episcopalians were greatly in the minority, but their church now became dominant over both Catholic and dissenter, and where the freethinker raised his head, he was smitten down. Catholic and dissenter and all alike were taxed to keep stable the established church. The old tolerance, such as it was over. Maryland paced even with the rest of the world. Presently the old capital of St. Mary's was abandoned. The government removed to the banks of the Severn, to Providence, soon, when Anne should be queen, to be renamed Annapolis. In vain the inhabitants of St. Mary's remonstrated. The center of political gravity in Maryland had shifted. The third Lord Baltimore died in 1715. His son Benedict, fourth Lord, turned from the Catholic Church and became a member of the Church of England. Dying presently, he left a young son, Charles, fifth Lord Baltimore, to be brought up in the fold of the Established Church. Reconciled now to the dominant creed, with a Maryland where Catholics were heavily penalized, Baltimore resumed the government under the favor of the Crown. But it was a government with a difference. In Maryland, as everywhere, the people were beginning to hold the reins, not again the old lord and the old underling. For years to come the lords would say that they governed, but strong life arose beneath, around, and above their governing. Maryland had by 1715 within her bounds more than 40,000 white men and nearly 10,000 black men. She still planted and shipped tobacco, but presently found how well she might raise wheat, and that it too was valuable to send away in exchange for all kinds of manufactured things. Thus Maryland began to be a land of wheat, still more than a land of tobacco. For the rest, conditions of life in Maryland paralleled pretty closely those in Virginia. Maryland was almost wholly rural. Her plantations and farms were reached with difficulty by roads hardly more than bridle paths, or with ease by sailboat and rowboat along the innumerable waterways. Though here and there manors, large, easy-going, patriarchal places with vague feudal ways and customs, were to be found, the moderate-sized plantation was the rule. Here stood in sight, usually of blue water, the planter's dwelling of brick or wood. Around it grew up the typical outhouses, household offices, and storerooms. Farther away yet clustered the cabin quarters, alike of slaves and indentured labor. Then stretched the fields of corn and wheat, the fields of tobacco. Here, at river or bay side, was the home wharf or landing. Here the tobacco was rolled in casks. Here rattled the anchor of the ship that was to take it to England and bring in return 1,001 manufactured articles. There were no factories in Maryland or Virginia, yet artisans were found among the plantation laborers: carpenters, coopers, sawyers, blacksmiths, tanners, curriers, shoemakers, spinners, weavers, and knitters. Throughout the colonies, as in every new country, men and women, besides being agriculturists, produced homemade much that men, women, and children needed. But many other articles and all luxuries came in the ships from overseas, and the harvest of the fields paid the account. End of Chapter 13.